Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. This show started out very differently than what it has become. It started in July 2017 when I had the idea to interview a range of religious practitioners from my old town of Columbia, Missouri. We talked about their practices, their routines, their favorite aspects of their religious traditions, and more. I interviewed many of the people who were frequent guest speakers in my own classroom back at Battle High School in Columbia. If my students got to meet the person in the room, the parents or their friends could listen to the podcast to get a taste of what the conversations were like when those guest speakers would visit the actual class. Virtually all of my guests up into the episode number 20s, including episode 20, which I deleted for specific reasons at the request of the guest, and even some episodes up into the 60s were people who at one point or another sat in my classroom and spent time with my students. So this was a real treat. But episode 22 was with Brad Warner, and that was a turning point for me. So Brad Warner is a well-known author of books about Zen Buddhism, Dogen, monster movies, punk rock, divorce, Zazen, and much more. And that was when the show became more about books, journalism, higher education, and research. Brad agreed to come on a podcast, this podcast, that had no listenership, but that has since gone on to release close to 120 more episodes since he appeared almost exactly 2 years ago to discuss his books, It Came From Beyond Zen and Don't Be a Jerk. So if you want to listen to me and Brad getting to know each other, or you want to hear his backstory a little bit about practicing Zen in Ohio and Japan, or meeting his teacher, Nishijima Roshi, and returning to the U.S. to start the Angel City Zen Center, you should go listen to episode number 22. It's still there, and it's a great episode. I really, really liked it. Last October, I also had the chance to meet Brad in Cleveland, Ohio, when he came to talk to the Crooked River Zen Center. Cleveland is just 3 hours away from where I live in Buffalo, so I popped down there. And I absolutely love meeting past podcast guests. Hi to all my guests that I've actually met in real life. And getting to meet Brad in person was really fun. So having Brad back on the show is a much different vibe this time around because I've gotten to spend some time with him, and he is a gracious return guest. So in this episode, we discussed Brad's brand new book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen, which is out now for my longtime friends at New World Library. We start off by talking about going on book tours, doing audiobooks, the premise for his new book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen, and then we get into some pretty heavy discussions about dying. Brad has a brand new podcast also associated with this book. So if you search for Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen, wherever you get podcasts, you can find Brad's brand new show. And you can visit Brad online at hardcorezen.info. So my deepest regards and thanks to Brad for coming back on the show. We had a ton of fun. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with return guest Brad Warner. Brad Warner, welcome back to Classical Ideas. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So I had you on the show ages ago now, and I've done like 115 episodes since you were last here, and we've actually met in person since I last had you here. So this is really exciting to have you back as a return guest. I'm really excited to chat with you about your brand new book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about tour to begin, because I met you on tour last year in Cleveland at the Crooked River Zen Center. Mm-hmm. So you're known as a musician and a Zen monk. And, you know, I go see live music all the time. Musicians go on tour with their bands to try and expand their audience and make new fans. And you start your new book with a story of being on tour and talking about Zen in Germany. And I couldn't help but notice that there are some parallels to the way you tour for Zen that may be similar to how you might tour in a punk band. So can you talk a little bit about what your life is like on tour? Is it a comfortable existence? Is it uncomfortable? What is it like?
Well, it's gotten better. When I first started out doing these book tours or whatever, I was doing them pretty. The only framework I had for putting together a tour was how punk rock bands do it. So that's how I did it. I just slept on people's couches and took whatever I could for payment and just kind of went out and did it. So I ended up in some really crazy places that are even crazier than some of the ones in the book. I think in the book I mentioned the squat in Berlin that I was in that was freezing cold, and they were really nice people, but it was a very strange place to be in. That actually wasn't so bad. I've been in some places that were really crazy and kind of awful, but I've kind of worked it out so it's a little better. But I'm never comfortable because I'm not really. I don't know. I do this for a living, but I'm not really. The adventure of going out has kind of worn off for me because I grew up weird. I lived in Africa when I was a kid, and we would travel a lot when we lived in Africa, and then I moved to Japan, and so that was all exotic and strange for 11 years, and then I've been doing these European tours for 10 years now, and the sort of excitement that you get out of seeing new places and all that is largely gone. And now I'm just kind of going, oh my God, Berlin.
Yeah.
Even though Berlin's a really cool place to go, I'm just kind of going, oh
yeah.
I just want my corn checks and milk for breakfast or something, something normal after a while. But it's all right. It's a living, as the characters in the Flintstones used to always say.
How do you choose?
That?
Yeah, how do you choose where you go? Like, how do you prioritize your touring schedule?
Well, for the European things, it's kind of come down to there's certain people that have invited me again and again, and there's places that I know I'm going to go every year, and I've kind of worked those out, and then when I get an invitation for somewhere that I can slot in between one of those main gigs that I do all the time, then I do that. Like the first place I went in Europe was Finland. These people in Helsinki invited me to come, and because Hardcore Zen, my first book, had just been published in Finnish. So I got this invitation to come to Helsinki in 2009. And I'd been sort of talking to people in other places in Europe before that about coming, but I never had the means to do it because, the life of an author at my level is not all that. I'm not getting rich.
Yeah.
I get royalty checks twice a year for about $1,200 and go, oh, that's great. That'll keep me going for a day or two, So I don't, so I'm not making loads of money. But these Finnish people had a way to finance the trip to Finland, so I decided, well, I can tag, add some other things along with this, and that's what I did. I just got in contact with some of these other people in other countries, like in England and Germany and Netherlands, that had been talking to me before, and said, hey, I'm coming to Finland. I can probably swing by where you are, and that's how it began. And that's what I've been doing for 10 years. And now I've got a person in Germany who likes what I do, and she has been really good about setting up. Annette Mann is her name. And she's been really good about setting up my tour. So she kind of organizes it for me for the last 3 years. So it's been a lot better since I stopped organizing them myself.
It's awesome to have people on the other end who are looking out for us too,
Yeah, that's for sure.
So, as we discussed in our last episode, which was, like I said, about 2 years ago, almost on the dot, we talked about It Came From Beyond Zen, your last book. And I mentioned in that conversation that I'm a huge fan of your audiobooks because you tend to weave in little bits of creativity, fantastic little musical transitions, great pronunciation of challenging vocabulary. Like, I love your audiobooks, and I'm so glad that you make them yourself. And so I've been listening to the audiobook for Letters to a Dead Friend about Zen, And it threw me for a very pleasant loop when I started it because it's recorded live in front of actual audiences. How did you come to this decision for the direction and approach of your new audiobook for Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen?
Well, the book is written as a series of letters to my dead friend about Zen, which is, the title of the book. And the I don't know, the literary conceit is the phrase I've been using of the book, is that I'm traveling through Europe and I'm writing these letters to my friend who's just died, which is semi-fictional, but is not entirely fictional, because I did have two friends who died the same year when I was touring Europe, and I did write a diary entry to one of those friends that came out in the form of almost a letter to him, and then I just decided to kind of make that the whole book. And the book was finished in, I don't know, earlier this year. Was it this year? Yeah, I guess it was. And everything was done, and I was getting ready to do this tour of Europe, and it was like a last minute thing almost. About a week before I went on tour, this sort of idea hit me that I was going to be going to many of the same places where the letters are written from. So, I was going to be traveling to the same cities, sometimes the very same places, venues that are mentioned in the book, like Benedictushof and some of these other places that I go regularly. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting? Because I'm going to have to do lectures at these places anyway.
Yeah. And
instead of just doing a standard lecture, I could read the letter that came from that city. Like, if I was in Hamburg, I could read the letter that was written from Hamburg, and do that as a way. Usually when I give a talk, I am actually much more interested in the Q&A that follows the talk than I am in the talk. So I tend to kind of just create something that I think will spark a discussion. Because I'm not interested in just filling the audience's heads with my ideas.
Yeah.
I want to get some back and forth going. So the letters proved to be really good for stimulating conversations about what the letters were about, and just things in general, because the letters are very open, like I'm talking to a friend, and so that I think got people more in the mood for talking back to me. So the discussions that followed those letters were really good, and I saved those too. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with them, whether I'm going to put them out as well, but they all still they got recorded as well. So there's a whole other book there.
Did the audience members deeply engage with the material, like telling you stories about their own lives and how the death stories that you were writing about resonated with their lives too?
Yeah, sometimes that happened. Usually that's something people will do in private. Occasionally somebody will share something like that in front of an audience, but usually what happens with that kind of thing is people come up to me after and then tell me their story around that. But I think just the fact that I was talking about this stuff made it more real, and that was the whole reason for writing the book the way I did, because the book was originally, I proposed to New World Library a book called Zen 101, and I tried to write that in sort of almost a textbook fashion, about here's what you need to know about Zen, and I just couldn't get into my own writing. It was just boring, and I didn't care about it. So framing it as an actual conversation, although it's a one-sided conversation with my dead friend, made it all come to life. And I think people in the audiences picked up on that. And so rather than being sort of a dry lecture on the history and philosophy of Buddhism, it becomes something about why is this important? Because it's obviously important to me, or I wouldn't have been doing it so long. But I need to be able to convey why that's important.
Yeah, well, and another thing, just a practical matter, I found that you reading the book and recording it on tour to be almost like a productivity stroke of genius, because you probably saved yourself like 20 or 30 hours of sitting in your apartment talking to a microphone. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, that was that was one of the other appeals.
It's so
to
great
doing it. And it gave me a whole different way to do an audiobook, which I might do in the future. We'll see if it works out, but the way I've been doing them, I mean, you say you like them, and I enjoy doing the audiobooks because I was doing music. I was doing albums before, so working with sound is really interesting to me. And when I was doing the earlier audiobooks, I just thought, well, it's boring to just sit here and read the book aloud to an imaginary audience. So I started putting, weird like sound effects things and just kind of things that just amused me into it. And I don't know. I'd like to. I don't listen to that many audiobooks, but I have listened to a few, and I'd like to think that mine are a bit of a different animal from the ordinary audiobook.
Yeah, and I get them all. Like, I remember I drove from Buffalo to Washington, D.C., and I listened to There Is No God and He Is Always With You from front to back in one drive, and I was, like, engrossed the entire time. So, like, I really do think your audiobooks are awesome, and I think that everybody should check them out because it's such an awesome way to hear you tell the story within the book as well, and I think that's kind of the way that reading is going, too. We're mixing it up in the mediums that we use.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's nice to hear because I'm just doing them alone. Well, this one I was doing in front of an audience, but mostly I'm just doing them alone in my apartment and just going, well, I hope somebody gets this. I don't know.
Yeah. So let's get into the book a little bit. So Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen is directed to a friend of yours who passed away of cancer, Willard Marcus Clarkins, a.k.a. Marquee Moon, which I love the title of the name Marquee Moon as well because of the television record Marquee Moon. How has the reaction been to the book from people who knew all of you? You mentioned as well that Marquee is like an amalgamation of two people. Has anybody who knew you and these friends read the book and talked to you about what they thought about it?
Have they read the book? Well, the book is still too new, so I haven't really heard from anybody who knew the real Marquee and then read the book. But I can tell you another slightly different story, which is that I recently did an event in Akron, Ohio, at which I was looking out in the audience, and maybe 10 or so of the people who were sitting there in front of me were people who knew the person that I talked about, in the book, the actual person, including the actual Marquee Moon, because I didn't want to use the name of one of my actual passed away friends. And I have this friend, Mark Smith, who went by the name Marquee Moon whenever his sort of punk rock name was Marquee Moon. And he also knew one of the people who died, who had written the book about. And I said, well, can I use your name? Because I'd made up various sort of fake punk rock names, and they all sounded phony to me. And so using his, so he was there, he's sitting right in front of me as I'm reading this stuff. What I've been doing when I've been promoting this book is, instead of reading the letters that are in the book, I'm composing new letters to Marquee for each venue, which I think is much more interesting. And I'm turning these into a podcast, which is now up on. I put the first episode up a couple weeks ago.
Oh, so sweet. Nice.
Yeah, so now you can find it if you look on iTunes and Spotify and Podbean. The 3 places it's up so far, but I'm trying to get it everywhere. But anyway, so that's what I'm doing, and the reaction there was really interesting because I was a bit nervous to read this stuff in front of people who actually knew. The point of the book was to kind of write about Zen to an audience of people who, when I'm thinking of the so-called Marquee, since it's a pseudonym, but when I'm thinking of him, I'm thinking of these people who knew me before I was ever a Zen teacher. So I've got this whole, I've got 2 lives. I suppose anybody who has any degree of notoriety in the world does. But I've got these people who knew me well before I started writing books and things. And so and then I've got these other people who know me from the books, and the people who know me from the books often have a kind of a slightly fantastical image of who I am, and and all that, and which is often very hard to live up to. So I tend to shy away from that. But talking to the people who knew me before that, I can kind of I think I can make it more more real. And so we'll see once the people who knew him actually start reading the book, because I know a few of them have the book, and we'll see what they have to say about it. I don't know. I don't know how that'll be.
I think that could be a really cool podcast episode.
Yeah. Maybe I can work a conversation into there, with one of those people.
That would be so cool. I would love to listen to that, because, I think about talking to, I'm imagining if one of my friends passed away and I wrote about them and I was talking about them deeply and caringly and lovingly about somebody who's no longer here. And I would always wonder about how everybody else's memories gelled with what I was saying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, everybody's memories of a person are different, and that's one of the things you find out when somebody dies. I think all this stuff starts to come up, and you're going, "Oh, was he like that? I didn't know." So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Maybe I should have the real Marky Moon on the podcast. Although he's kind of he's a drummer for he's been a drummer for rock and roll bands for forever, and he likes to do that, but he also isn't a guy who likes to put himself out other than when there are drums in front of him.
Nice. Gotcha.
He's one of those guys. So I don't know if he'd want to be on the podcast or not.
Yeah. Well, so lines throughout this book are jumping out at me, and one of them that really grabbed my attention was when you write cancer, age 48, Jesus. And I'm about to be 36, and I think of, only having 12 more years on this earth, and that was a little bit of a gut punch, that line. And I know that you're older than 48, and this line came through in your voice on the audio. You know what I mean? Whenever I heard you say that line, it kind of made me cringe a little bit. What does this line remind you about in your day-to-day life right now?
Mortality and all that. Yeah, it's... the guy I was thinking of when I wrote that, both of the people were about the same age that I'm writing to, and they were both 2 years behind me in high school. So they were sophomores when I was a senior. So I knew both of them in high school, and so yeah, it's weird to because you kind of if you first, at least for me anyway, when I first meet somebody, that's the version of them that sort of sticks with me forever, and I think most of us are kind of like that. So it's hard, even though I followed my friends throughout their lives and their changes and stuff, they're always in some sense going to be that 13-year-old kid that hung around, that followed me around sometimes, and that's so when somebody like that dies of cancer, my God, that's a heavy thing to deal with, and of course, you sort of go, oh my God, I could die like that myself, and it's all, it all gets stuck in there. For myself, I've been kind of aware of the specter of death. I think, I don't know if all people go through this. For me, it was really early on, because two of my aunts died of this terrible genetic disorder while I was a teenager, where they were both dying of it, and in advanced stages. And then my mom also passed away from that, and I was older by the time she died, but it was still pretty devastating to see. So it from my mid-teens, I knew that there was this looming possibility of this horrible genetic disorder that runs in my family, killing me before I even got to be the age I am now. I'm kind of surprised at how old I am now. I'm kind of going, oh, I didn't expect to get this old. So we'll see where that goes. But it's so yeah, I there's this kind of weird thing that happens in certain Eastern religions. It happens a little bit in Buddhism, but it's very prevalent in Hinduism, where you are instructed to sit and ponder your own death, as if whoever came up with these instructions imagines that the people he or she is talking to don't think about that a lot. And I always look at those going, I don't need this because I think about it too much, and I have since a young age. But that tends to be a kind of a trope in Eastern religions, is to remind you that you're going to die someday, and we all know this. Personally, I don't need the reminders because I'll remind myself enough. But maybe some people need the reminders. I don't know.
Yeah, and like I love the wide range of your books too. You're always very honest in your writing. That's the way it comes off. Like Zen wrapped in karma, dipped in chocolate, super honest. And when you wrote another line in this book that says, "When grief comes, I let it come." And knowing your body of work, I was like, well, yeah, that completely makes sense. So in the wake of Marky's death, you also write, "What am I doing with my life?" So did these deaths affect you differently than other deaths? Were these like, because obviously you wrote a book about them. So how did these deaths resonate differently than other deaths that you've experienced?
I don't know. That whole "what am I doing with my life" thing was about Zen, because very sort of early on in my late teens, I got introduced to Zen Buddhism, and I started doing this practice, this Zazen meditation practice, and getting very deeply into the philosophy of Zen, and kind of ended up dedicating my life to it. So I've had this for a long time, and part of why I got into it was to deal with the sort of pervasive fear of death that was going on already. As I said, in my mid-teens, I got sort of like hit with this idea that I might not have long to live. And then, what am I going to do with that? And there's all sorts of things. It's been a while since I've done this, but I actually spent some time years ago, 20 or more years ago, looking into how people who have terminal diseases or genetic disorders and things, things where they feel like they might have a kind of an expiration date on their lives, unlike, most people, I suppose, who kind of just go through it thinking they're going to live forever, and but they don't they don't live forever either. But those of us who sort of get told early on, and there's a lot of things people do. They get into hedonism, and a lot of people it's kind of a syndrome where people become very daredevilish. If you look into people who are jumping motorcycles across canyons and things, crazy things like that, you'll often find that there's something like that going on in their lives, that they have something behind that, like a disease in the family or something like that. And so it's always been some, that's always been there. And so I don't know, it's sort of different. The actual Marky Moon is not the first person close to my age that I knew that died, but he's probably the closest person, as far as somebody being a close friend who then died much too young. Most of the other people I knew I was not that close to, who were around my age. So that sort of, puts the fear of God into you, as they say in some areas. So I guess it affected me in that sense of the reality of it, of the reality of how short our time is on Earth. And you want to do something with your time, you want to do something worthwhile. I think, that's, I guess probably most people do. Even if you're getting into hedonism, you're thinking that the worthwhile thing to do with your life is to, get as much pleasure as possible, before everything goes sour. But a lot of people get into causes. In fact, just before I got on here, I was reading the story of some Buddhist a scholar who found out that he had ALS, and then he's been on this sort of big kick to prove that Buddhism is full of violence, and, which I find kind of a fascinating thing. But it's an article that's being shared a lot in the Buddhist community within the past week or so about how violent Buddhism is, and I think he's wrong. But then I'm also reading that he has ALS, and that this is his response to having ALS makes me less anxious to criticize him, because I'm like, he probably feels like he's got to put this out there in what little time he has left. And I think that's the way a lot of people respond.
Well, I just want to briefly comment on that. I love your outspokenness within the Buddhist community. I think that it's really interesting and needed and refreshing. And I know that you have, faced some issues all by yourself, it seems like,
Yeah, it's hard to say. American Buddhism, at least in the large coastal cities where it's most popular, has been kind of gripped with the same sort of heavily leftist politics thing that the rest of the coastal cities have been gripped with for the past few years, and I think there's a tendency for people to get confused because Buddhism is all about treating people nicely, and then they think, well, the way to treat people nicely is to be to have the left-wing political policy, so let's push that, and that's Buddhism. And so there's a lot of confusion over what Buddhism is about, and whenever I point that out, people from those organizations get mad because I'm not towing the line. I try not to be. I try not to get real political or to take sides, but I think that Buddhism should not be, these kind of a kind of party political thing, because then you're just limiting it to people who already agree with your political point of view, and I don't think that does anybody any good. You want this sort of good thing to be available to anybody who's ready to receive it, no matter who they voted for.
Right.
And that's kind of my stance.
So, yeah, and you actually write about that a little bit in the book. There's a quote that jumps out at me when you write, "The emerging consensus of American Zen seems to me to be an attempt to capture the beast, anesthetize it, pull out its claws and teeth, and force it to breed tame, clawless, fangless offspring." So you came to Zen from what you describe as a sort of like out of the ordinary approach. And I wonder if you could speak to the people who may be discovering Zen out there right now, like those punk rock kids in Ohio or Kentucky or North Carolina or Arizona who are finding Zen. What might you, as somebody who came to it from an unorthodox way, what might you encourage them to do, feeling the way that you do about the Zen American infrastructure?
Gosh, I don't know. Don't listen to the Zen American infrastructure, I think would be the main thing. The reason I got into Zen, or one of the reasons I got into Zen, is because I felt like it was, and I used to say this as a kind of line all the time, it was like the most punk rock thing I'd ever come across. When I was all the things that I got into punk rock for, I looked at the Zen approach and I was like, oh, that takes the punk rock, the same sort of punk rock stance, but goes all the way with it. They don't just stop at questioning, the authority figures or the masses. They're actually applying that same attitude of questioning to themselves. Instead of going, I am right and all these people are wrong, they're going, all these people are wrong and I'm probably wrong too. Which I think is a very interesting approach, and I think that's something to look at. And I think what happens with any sort of a religious or philosophical movement is that as it becomes popular, there's a tendency to kind of want to make it more popular, and then you start doing things to make it more appealing and to kind of frame it and sort of limit it and sort of canonize it and turn it into, well, this is exactly what we want and it's going to be in this fixed form. And I think what the Zen form of Buddhism especially, and this may go to some extent for all forms of Buddhism, but it's especially prevalent in Zen, is that it refuses to be boxed in that way. And there's a lot of people out there right now in America who are trying their darndest to box it in as much as possible. And I think to a certain extent they're going to succeed. That's my I sort of resign myself to the idea that eventually there'll be a Zen or Buddhist orthodoxy in America, just like there is in Japan and just like there is in a lot of Buddhist countries. And that orthodoxy will be just as crappy as every other religious orthodoxy, because they're all terrible. So these people who are pushing that in the Zen world, I think, are just really dumb if they think that they're going to create an orthodoxy that's any better than any other orthodoxy has ever been. And that's my argument there.
Nice. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about the questioning that you put forth in this book about why you do what you do. And there's this awesome part where you write, sitting, meditating my life away as it all passes by, lighting incense and candles, bowing to nothing, chanting the same stupid crap that they've chanted since forever ago, because maybe this time it will work. So throughout the book, you seem to be like legitimately questioning and seriously confronting your Zen practice. Could you ever see yourself stopping?
No, I couldn't do it, and the reason is because it's been so useful to me, and that questioning part of it in the first draft of that book, it was much more brutal than it is in the finished version, and my editor was saying, oh, you got to take some of this out, because nobody's going to read past this, because you just trash. I just trashed all of Zen in the first chapter, and then how am I going to expect anybody to want to read the rest of the book about Zen after I've just, killed it off right in the beginning? But that's the way I look at it. Honestly, I sometimes go, oh, what good is this? But the thing that keeps me into it is that I can see, and I saw that very early on, what good it was, because I started doing Zen because I took this, almost randomly took this class at Kent State University called Zen Buddhism, which I didn't know. I knew a little. I knew that Zen was, I knew Buddhism was an Indian philosophy, and I knew that Zen was its Japanese manifestation, and that was probably the extent of my knowledge about Zen. But I was taking philosophy courses, and I thought, well, this is kind of an unusual philosophy course. Let's see where this goes. So I didn't come into it because I wanted to get into Zen. A lot of people, get very excited about Zen long before they start practicing. And I started practicing long before I got excited about Zen. And the thing is, I because I wasn't trying to be into Zen, I did it initially during that class, and I hung on to it for a few months afterwards. And then I stopped. But then after I stopped, I'm going, oh, I feel crappy now. Why do I feel so crappy? And then I go, oh, I'm not doing that Zazen thing every morning like I used to. Okay, I'll go back and do it for a while. And I repeated this cycle. I didn't count how many times, but maybe 3, 4, or 5 times. I don't really know how many times I gave up on Zen, but it was more than once. And every time I just come back to it, because I just saw the usefulness of it. I wasn't sort of having enlightenment experiences or, floating through the clouds. Or I met a guy yesterday at a bus stop in LA who was smoking a joint, as people do now. Mm-hmm. And he started talking to me, and I mentioned writing books about meditation, and he went, oh, have you been to other dimensions? And I'm like, no, I haven't really been to other dimensions. So people sort of have this imagination of what meditation is going to be like, and it's not really about going to other dimensions. You're just kind of, most of the time, you're just sitting there, and it's boring, but it was great for me. It was really great. And after a few years, I did start to have some surprising experiences that, I've written about them in books. I wasn't about to tell the guy at the bus stop smoking a joint about it, because I thought, oh, this is going to go in a weird direction if I tell him about some of the stranger things that happened during meditation. But the thing is, those things won't start happening for most people if they're healthy for years. If somebody's kind of goes into it in an unhealthy mental state, they might start tripping out right away. But generally, if you're okay, your first few years, maybe even 5 or 10 years of meditation is going to be mainly boring. But after you kind of pass a certain mark, there's a depth to it that shows itself. And I think that's one of the important aspects of this practice, is that you're trying to get really comfortable with being bored before anything exciting happens, because otherwise the excitement of what might happen as a result of a meditation practice will probably ruin your meditation practice, because you'll just get so into like, I want that exciting thing to happen again. And,
Yeah. I've spoken a lot on this show about my lapsing meditation practices, and how I binge meditate, where I'll like not do anything for months, and then I'll go to a retreat and sit there and suffer like a complete moron. It's really hilarious. But this book also got me thinking about my friendships. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm about to be 36, and I've had friends that I'm so dear friends with, but all of a sudden life has gotten busy, and then all of a sudden we're in our mid-30s and we haven't seen each other in years, and those years fly by instantaneously. And this book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen, got me thinking about this, and I think about all of the unsaid and undone things of life constantly, especially with my friends who have grown distant. And so with Marky, you write, there are times when I feel like if we had discussed it, maybe together, we'd have come around to something valuable. Did this book help you, like, with alleviating those feelings of missing your friends and things being left unsaid? Was this like a helpful, like, sort of like therapeutic exercise for you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was. And well, all my books are sort of attempts to reach an audience who would normally not be interested in this stuff. So in a sense, I'm doing the same thing as I've always done, but this was a little different in that I'm talking to somebody real specific about it. And yeah, it helped. It's sort of a way, because as you mentioned, there are people who knew him who are now going to be reading the book, or probably already are at the moment. And, maybe it'll speak to them, or maybe it'll say something to them as well. So it's not all lost. And I had this funny question when I did my first podcast, which is up now if you want to look at it or listen to it, in England, where somebody asked, what do I feel about, Marky, the person who died now? Do I feel like he's just completely gone from this universe? And then the person who asked the question said, I would assume from your writing that you think he just doesn't exist at all. And I said, well, no, I don't really think he doesn't exist at all. I think I hold out the possibility that there's some sort of continuity there. I don't insist that there is, but I don't think it's completely stupid to posit that there might be, something that continues on. But So in a way, maybe I am addressing him. I don't know, but I'm also addressing myself, in him, and I'm also talking to myself about why I'm doing this practice. Because I remember going to Tassajara, which is a Zen monastery up in Northern California, one year, about to spend like a month there in cloistered sort of meditation practice, and going, what the hell am I doing here? I could be having fun.
Yeah.
So there's that too.
What reminds you of Marky or dead friends or family in your day-to-day life? Do you like take moments and reflect on these people just with like stimuli out in the world when you're just going about your normal business?
Well, yeah, I mean, with the person that I was most thinking about when I wrote this book, we had a lot in common. So it's difficult for a day to go by when something doesn't remind me of him, because it's just all the same things that I do. He was into a lot of the same music and other things in the sort of pop culture world that we all inhabit these days. Was something we held common between us. So there's a lot that reminds me of him, and it reminds me of the people that I've lost. And in a sense, I think they're all still with us. And I don't know about in the sort of cosmic experiential sense, but I do know for sure that these people are part of my life and always will be, and the influence we had on each other was mutual, even though he was younger than me. He had an influence on me, and so there's that as well.
Are there any records or anything, or movies or comic books or anything that really, you associate with this person?
Oh yeah. I think somebody was playing Danzig one time, and I
Oh,
was thinking,
dude,
oh
yes.
God, he used to blast. We shared a house together, and I remember him just blasting Danzig to the point where I'm like, oh God, stop it with the Danzig.
Funny story about
Oh,
Danzig. I just saw the original Misfits at Madison Square Garden 2 weeks ago
God.
with
Zero
Danzig.
Defects opened for the Misfits.
Dude,
Not at Madison Square
unbelievable.
Garden.
Oh
We
my
opened
gosh.
for him at this rented it wasn't a VFW hall. It was a place called the Big Room, and it was just this sort of party room. A lot of probably every city has them, but mid-level cities like Akron have a lot of these sort of little party rooms that people can rent out and throw a party at, and that's. Jimmy and Vince, two guys from our scene, had gone and rented this place so that the Misfits could come and play a show, and it was very DIY. And that was when Zero Defects opened for the Misfits.
You have no idea how awesome it is that you just told me that. Like that's the coolest thing ever, dude. Like
Yeah,
amazing.
it was a pretty cool show because they were already they were this was 1983, I think,
Yeah.
maybe 82, but there is a video. There's no video of that show, but there is a video because the next day they played in Detroit. And they got interviewed, and they say, where have you been? And said, well, last night we were in Akron, and and I'm like,
Awesome.
what? Yeah, so that's kind of fun. And there's a couple. It's funny how, because film was so precious in those days, and people didn't have digital cameras. So I've only ever seen maybe 4 photographs from that gig, and I'm just going, wow, because people were so poor they didn't want to, they didn't want to take a bunch of photographs of the Misfits.
Well, if you have a chance to see the Misfits right now with Danzig and Dave Lombardo on drums, like you should 100% just suck it up and spend the money and go, because it was
Really?
incredible.
Huh, that's good. It was a great show even then, because they were, I'd always been a fan of Kiss, and they put on a show that was almost like a Kiss type of show, but in this tiny little venue. And I remember being really impressed by their performance, and I'd heard the album before they came through, because that Misfits Walk Among Us was already out, but it didn't prepare me for actually seeing what they were like, and I thought they did a great show.
Well, Danzig is a force of nature and has been ever since. So, Brad, I am super happy to have you back on the show. I am really, really pleased reading your new book. It gives me a ton to think about, and I think that everybody should check out Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. Also, being a podcast nerd, I'm also excited to learn today of your new podcast project, so thank you for telling everybody about that. And where can people find you if they want to follow your work?
Well, the easiest place is hardcorezen.info. That's .info. So Hardcore Zen is the name of my first book. And then I got the .info domain because I couldn't get the .com. Excuse me, because I couldn't get the .com domain. So that's hardcorezen.info has links to everything. And you just reminded me I haven't put podcast links on there yet because the podcast just went up. So, but everything is linked from there if you go to hardcorezen.info.
Well, Brad, thank you so much, sir. This has been a real blast, and I am just so glad to have your voice on Classical Ideas once again.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to cut it there.
Good.
Dude,
Yeah,
that
I'm
was
looking at
super.
my
That was
clock.
that was
I guess
super
we went
fun.
over. Well, actually, no. My clock is counting from the time we first started talking.
Oh,
So
no, we did
maybe
really
it's
well.
okay.
Like, I have to be at my daughter's school in like 40 minutes, and it's 2 minutes away. So
Okay.
I have all the time in the world. So we had a way better chat, I think, because you were able to come on early. So once again, I'm super grateful to you. Otherwise, it would have been really fast and really pressurized. And I think that we
Yeah,
had
no worries.
I think we had a lot more fun this way.
Yeah, it's good. I think it worked out good.
Awesome, dude. Well, I'm going to put this thing out ASAP, as soon
Okay.
as I can. And I have a really fresh episode up right now, so it'll probably be about a week or so, but I will tag you on socials and all that garbage that you hate, and I will keep you posted, okay?
All right, thank you.
Dude, Brad, been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and I will chat with you soon, okay?
Okay, bye.
Have an awesome day. Bye.
You too, bye.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com. Or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.